She walked into a room full of criminals, killers, and men who had buried secrets deeper than graves, and every single one of them went quiet. Not because of a weapon, not because of a threat, but because of a name. 2 words, and in this city, those 2 words were the last thing some people ever heard. This is not a story about power. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful woman in the city looks across a blood-soaked basement at a fighter she has never met, and for the first time in 20 years, forgets every rule she ever made for herself. There is a city that exists in 2 worlds simultaneously. In one world, there are glass towers and charity galas, women in silk dresses sipping champagne imported from estates they will never visit, men in tailored suits shaking hands over deals that reshape skylines. In the other world, the one that breathes beneath the first, like a second heartbeat, there are no names on the doors, no cameras on the walls, and the only currency that matters is the kind you bleed for. Most people spend their entire lives in one world or the other. They never see the seam between them. But there are a rare few who were born in the bottom world and clawed their way up through the seam. And those are the most dangerous people in any city on earth. Reina Vasquez was one of them. Her name carried the same weight as a loaded gun pressed flat against your temple. You did not speak it carelessly. You did not use it in vain. If you were smart, and most people in this city had learnt to be smart the hard way, you did not speak it at all unless you were in a room where every face was loyal and every door was locked. Reina Vasquez had built her empire from nothing, which is a phrase people use so often it has lost its edge. So let us be precise. She had built her empire from grief, from the specific, slow-burning grief of watching everything you love get taken from you by people who believe that power gives them the right to take. Her father had run a modest shipping operation out of the southern docks, a legitimate business, honest in the way that only people who have never had enough can afford to be honest. She had been 16 when the men came, 18 when she understood fully what they had taken, 22 when she took it back, and then some.
By the time this story begins, Reina Vasquez was 38 years old, and she was untouchable. Not in the soft, poetic sense of the word, in the literal sense. People did not touch Reina Vasquez. They nodded. They waited to be spoken to. They answered every question completely and honestly because they had seen or heard about in hushed and horrified tones what happened to people who did not.
She had 3 legitimate businesses that laundered her actual operations with such elegant efficiency that the city's top accountants could not find the seam. She had a penthouse that occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building she owned outright. And when she stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows at night and looked down at the city below, she was not looking at it the way the rest of us look at cities, with wonder or longing or the small sweet ache of belonging. She was looking at it the way a chess player looks at the board, calculating, always calculating. But here is what nobody knew about Reina Vasquez. Here is the thing that her empire, her reputation, her absolute mastery of every room she entered had successfully hidden from every person who had ever worked for her, feared her, or tried to destroy her. She was lonely in a way that had no bottom. She had built something indestructible, and it had cost her everything soft inside herself to do it. And for 20 years, she had told herself that was acceptable. That was the price. Some nights, standing at those windows with the city laid out below her like a kingdom, she believed it. Most nights, she did not. She had her rules, and they were absolute. Do not draw attention from federal agencies. Do not engage in disputes that cannot be resolved cleanly. Do not allow personal feeling to interfere with operational logic. And the last rule, the one that her second in command, a lean and efficient woman named Sola, had heard her say exactly once, in the quiet aftermath of a situation that had almost cost them everything. Do not want anything you cannot afford to lose. Reina Vasquez had built her world on that principle. She kept her world tight, controlled and cold, in the way that certain beautiful things are cold. Marble, diamonds, the surface of still water before something breaks it. She was about to break every single one of those rules, and she was going to do it for a woman she had not yet met, in a basement she had no business being in, on an ordinary Thursday night that was about to become the most dangerous night of her life. Not because anyone was going to try to kill her, but because someone was about to make her feel something she had trained herself for 20 years to never feel again. She did not go to the fights because she was bored. She went because the underground fight circuit was a revenue stream, and because 3 promoters owed her percentages they had recently become creative in their accounting of. She did not send someone else to handle it because some messages needed to be delivered in person. She brought Sola and 2 others. Not a small detail, but not overwhelming either, which was itself a statement. I am not afraid of you, and I do not need to perform safety to prove it. She wore black because she always wore black. She wore heels because she always wore heels. She descended into the basement of a building in the industrial quarter, listed as a storage facility for automotive parts and containing some automotive parts in a section of the first floor visible from the street, in the way that all truly excellent deceptions contain just enough truth to stop a casual question. She walked through a door that opened when a man recognized her face and stepped back quickly enough to communicate everything about the power dynamic in this room. And then she stopped walking, mid-step, like something had reached out of the air in front of her and placed a hand flat against her chest. Because of what was happening in the ring, because of her, the underground fight circuit was not what people imagined who had never been to one. There was a ritual to it, a structure that the people who organised these things had developed over years of trial and error. There was a crowd, dense and warm, and charged with the kind of energy that lives just below the skin of everyone who has come to watch other people get hurt. There were betting operations running along the perimeter, quiet and focused and extraordinarily lucrative. And in the centre of all of it, under lights that had no business being as good as they were, in a building officially storing automotive parts, there was a cleared space, roughly circular, and in that space, at the moment Reina walked in, there was a woman fighting. The first thing that registered was not the fight, it was the movement. There is a difference between people who have learned to fight and people who were built for it, and it is a difference that is immediately, viscerally apparent to anyone watching. The woman in the ring was not large. She was lean in the way of something engineered rather than simply made, compact and proportioned, with a kind of geometric precision that made every movement look inevitable. She was faster than the person she was fighting, but that was not what stopped Reina. What stopped her was the economy. Not a single wasted motion. Every shift of weight, every pivot of hip, every extension of arm existed in direct, unbroken service to the goal. She was not performing. She was not showing off. She was solving the problem in front of her with the focused, almost meditative efficiency of someone who had long since stopped thinking about what they were doing and had simply become it. She was beautiful in the way that truly dangerous things are beautiful. The way a hawk looks beautiful at the moment of the strike. Sola, half a step behind Reina, nearly walked into her back, pulled up short, looked at Reina's profile, and then looked at what Reina was looking at and understood, with the calm observational intelligence that made Sola valuable, that something had just shifted. Sola had worked for Reina Vasquez for 11 years. She had seen her angry, and she had seen her cold, and she had seen her in the calculated fury of a business decision that required violence and the quiet aftermath. She had never seen her still, not like this, not arrested, not stopped mid-step by something she had not anticipated. The fight ended in 40 seconds. It ended the way most fights ended, when one person was significantly more skilled, not explosively, but with a grim, grinding inevitability. The larger woman went down. The crowd made its sound, that collective exhale of people whose money was now moving, and the woman in the centre of the cleared space stood for a moment in the aftermath, her chest rising and falling, her hands loose at her sides. She looked at the crowd the way someone looks at a landscape, taking it in without particular investment. And then her gaze found Reina Vasquez and stopped, cold, complete, the way a door stops when it meets its frame, not forced, not dramatic, simply arrived. And for 3 seconds, in a basement full of criminals and money and noise and violence, the two most dangerous women in the room looked at each other across the space between them, and neither one of them moved, and neither one of them breathed, and both of them understood with the immediate, wordless clarity of two people built for reading situations that something had just begun. Something neither of them had planned for, something that neither one of them, if they were being completely honest with themselves, and they were both, above everything, brutally honest, wanted to walk away from. Her name was Nadia Cruz, and she was about to become the most complicated problem Reina Vasquez had ever tried to solve. Not because she was an enemy, but because she was the opposite. She was 26 years old, and she had been fighting in underground circuits for 4 years, long enough to have developed the reputation she had, and short enough that her body had not yet started compiling the debt the sport eventually levied on everyone. She had grown up in the eastern quarter of the city, in the specific geography of financial scarcity and physical density that produces certain kinds of people. People who become hard early, who learn the mathematics of risk at an age when other children are learning more abstract numbers. Her mother had worked double shifts. Her older brother had tried a different route and had died for it when Nadia was 17, an event that had closed something in her and opened something else, something harder, more focused, less willing to be afraid of anything, because she had learned at 17 that the worst thing that could happen to you was survivable. And once you knew that, truly knew it in your body, in the marrow, fear lost most of its authority. She had trained under a woman named Gracia, who ran a gym above a dry cleaning operation, and who had been, in another life, a professional fighter of some regional note. Gracia had recognized in Nadia something that coaches rarely found and never manufactured: the specific interior stillness that allowed a fighter to be completely in the moment, uncontaminated by fear or ego, simply present and responsive in the way that the very best fighters were. She had trained her for 3 years, and then Nadia had walked into her first underground bout and won, and then kept winning. And the circuit had taken notice, and now she was here, in this basement, with a crowd of people who had placed money on her and had been, once again, correct. She did not know who Reina Vasquez was in that first moment. She knew she was someone. The stillness of the bodies around this woman, the particular quality of deference that radiated from the people flanking her, the absolute certainty with which she occupied the space she stood in, as though the space had always belonged to her. Nadia had spent 4 years reading rooms the way she read fights. She knew power when she looked at it. She recognized the weight of it. What she didn't know was the name or the specific shape of the danger. And she filed that information gap as something to resolve. And then the promoter was in front of her with her payment, and the crowd was rearranging itself. And when she looked back at the space where the woman had been standing, the woman was gone. Except she was not. She had moved to the corner where the promoter's operation was set up. A table, a laptop, 2 men with the kind of stillness that communicated professional comfort with violence. And she was having a conversation that looked quiet, brief, and completely final. The promoter, a heavy-set man named Ortega, whom Nadia had always found slightly repellent, was nodding in the rapid, desperate way of someone confirming information they wished they did not have to confirm. The conversation ended. Reina turned, and across the room, across the crowd and the noise and the bodies, her eyes found Nadia again, as though they had never lost her. Nadia Cruz, who had stood in the centre of cleared spaces and looked at the crowd with complete equanimity for 4 years, felt something move in her chest. Not fear. She had made a comprehensive peace with fear long ago. Something else. Something she categorized with the practical, no-nonsense intelligence that characterized her inner life as a problem. She asked about her. Ortega looked at her with pure incredulity and then said very slowly the name. Reina Vasquez. And then nothing else, because the name was sufficient. Nadia sat with that information for a moment, nodded, put her jacket on, and left. She thought about her for 3 days. Not obsessively. Nadia was not a person given to obsession, but persistently. The way you think about something that has embedded itself in the architecture of your thoughts without your permission. She thought about the way the woman had stood, not rigidly, but absolutely, the way a building stands, with the certainty of something that has decided to occupy its ground and cannot be moved from it. She thought about the eyes, still and dark and completely, uncomfortably focused. She thought about the moment their gaze met across the room and the quality of that meeting. Not the casual accident of 2 people glancing in the same direction, but something deliberate on both sides, something that had the texture of a decision being made simultaneously by 2 separate people who had not consulted each other. And then on a Tuesday morning, she walked into her gym in the Western District at 6 in the morning, as she always did, and there was someone sitting on the bench near the entrance who should not have been sitting on the bench near the entrance. Someone wearing a coat that cost more than Nadia's monthly rent, reading something on her phone with the specific air of someone who is not actually reading something on their phone, but is instead waiting, and who is entirely comfortable with being the person who makes someone else come to them. Nadia stopped in the doorway. She stood there for a moment because she was not going to rush, and then walked to her locker, put her bag down, came back, and sat on the bench 3 feet away, not close enough to be presumptuous, not far enough to be theatrical about the distance. Reina Vasquez put her phone in her pocket and turned. Up close, she was more striking and more specific. The features that had read as composed from across a crowded room were, in proximity, the product of something more interesting than simple composure. They were the features of someone who had trained themselves into stillness from the outside in and carried the training as though it had always been nature. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that age and stress and the specific weight of 2 decades of empire building had placed there, and they did not diminish the impact of the face. They deepened it. She looked at Nadia directly, without the social softening most people applied to eye contact to make it less confrontational. And she said, in a voice lower than Nadia had expected, "You are wasted here." Nadia considered several responses. She selected the honest one. She said, "You don't know where I am." At the corner of Reina's mouth, something happened that was not quite a smile and was more interesting than a smile would have been. She said, "I know exactly where you are. I want to discuss where you could be." In the language that Nadia had grown up speaking, this was an offer. It had the shape and grammar of one, and she understood that accepting it meant entering a world whose rules were different and whose costs were correspondingly different. She also understood, sitting 3 feet from this woman in the early morning quiet of a gym, that the danger she had categorized 3 days ago as a problem had not diminished with proximity. It had clarified. It was specific and it was mutual. She could read that in the quality of Reina Vasquez's stillness, which was not, she now realized, the stillness of simple control. It was the stillness of a person holding something very still, because they were not entirely certain what it would do if they let it move. She said, "I'm listening." What followed was a 45-minute conversation that covered, in efficient and specific terms, exactly what Reina needed and exactly what she was offering. Someone whose physical presence communicated the possibility of violence without requiring it. Someone who could read the room the way Reina read rooms. The compensation was significant. The expectations were clear. The consequences of failure were described without drama, because the absence of drama was its own most effective emphasis. Reina did not speak about the other thing. Neither did Nadia. It was present in the room the way certain silences are present, louder than anything being said, impossible to ignore, acknowledged by the deliberate and mutual agreement not to acknowledge it. Nadia said, "I need 48 hours." Reina Vasquez stood, straightened her coat, and walked out of the gym without the hurry of someone who was not confident in the outcome. She said one thing on her way to the door. She said, "You have 24. Nadia called Gracia. Gracia listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual. And then she said 3 sentences. The first was, "You already know what you're going to do." The second was, "Be very careful, because careful is the thing that keeps you alive when you walk into a world like that." The third was, "And Nadia, not everything that pulls you toward it is trying to destroy you." Nadia called Reina's number after 18 hours. Not 48, not 24, 18, which was her honest answer to the question of how long it had actually taken her to decide. She said yes. The first month was an education. She learnt the layout of the operation, Not the full geography, which was compartmentalized in ways she understood were protective, but the sections relevant to her function. She learned the people. Sola, whose assessment of Nadia took 2 weeks to complete and, when it concluded, produced a quality of professional respect that Nadia valued precisely because Sola did not appear to value many things. A man named Paco, who handled logistics with sorrowful competence, as though the logistics were always failing him, and he was always solving them anyway. An older woman named Bertha, who functioned as something between a financial architect and an institutional memory, and who looked at Nadia on the first day with an expression of recognition, not of Nadia herself, but of a type, a pattern, something she had seen arrive before and knew, because she had been watching this organisation for 20 years, exactly what it meant. She attended her first formal meeting 2 weeks in, private dining room of a restaurant Reina owned through 2 holding companies. The people across the table were 2 men who ran the Port Authority's informal contracting relationships. Nadia stood against the wall near the door. She did not speak. She watched Reina negotiate, which was its own education entirely, the precision of it, the absolute economy of language, the way she offered things and withdrew them and allowed silences to grow until the person inside the silence felt compelled to fill it. And then the way she used what they said to fill it as leverage, without acknowledging she was using it as leverage. After the meeting, when the other men had gone and the room was quiet, Reina said to Nadia without preamble, "Your observations." Nadia said, "The one on the left makes the decisions. The one on the right explains them afterward. You spent the last 10 minutes talking to the one on the right, which means you don't actually need the decision. You already have it." Something crossed Reina's face. Not surprise, more the quality of someone who had asked a test question and found the answer exceeded what the test was designed to measure. She said, "Correct," and walked out. Nadia stood in the empty room for a moment and filed that exchange as evidence of something she was building a case for, though she could not yet have said what the case was. Now, this is where the story changes shape, because for the first 6 weeks, everything that has been described was operational, professional, 2 extraordinary women in the same orbit, both too self-aware and too disciplined to act on what was obvious to everyone around them. But there is a point in every situation, no matter how controlled, no matter how precisely constructed, where the pressure that has been building somewhere below the floor finally finds the crack it has been looking for. The crack appeared on a Wednesday evening, and it arrived the way all the most important things arrive, not announced, not dramatic. A question. In an empty office at 9 at night, after 4 hours of working a complicated problem together, with the city outside the windows and a bottle on the desk between them, Reina Vasquez poured 2 glasses without asking, set one near Nadia's chair and said, "How did you develop that? The analytical thing, the ability to read a conflict the way she read a fight." Nadia told her about Gracia, about the idea that a fight was a conversation, every move a sentence, every combination a paragraph, and if you learned to read the grammar of it, you could read any conversation the same way. Reina listened in the complete way she did everything, and then she said something that hit the room differently than everything else she had said in 6 weeks. She said, "My brother taught me to negotiate before he was taken." It was the first time in 6 weeks of daily proximity that Reina Vasquez had voluntarily offered anything about herself that was not operational or strategic. It landed with the weight of something significant, and both of them felt it, and neither of them moved immediately. Then Reina picked up her glass and looked out at the city, and she said quietly, "I built this so no one could ever take anything from me again. And it works. And there is a cost to the things that work the way this does." Nadia said, "What's the cost?" Reina turned from the window. She looked at Nadia directly. She said, "You know what the cost is." And Nadia did know. She had built her own smaller version of the same fortress. The compact, efficient life with no unnecessary dependencies. The interior stillness that was partly gift and partly armour. The perfect solitude that was both freedom and its opposite. She had known it about herself for years and had made peace with it, the way you make peace with a wound that healed wrong, acknowledging it, working around it, not asking too much of it. She had not expected to encounter its mirror in a woman who was everything she was not in the external circumstances of her life, and everything she was in the internal ones. She said, "I know." They sat in that office for another hour. They did not touch. They talked in the way that happens when a door that has been held almost shut is finally fully opened. The conversation rushing through it with the pressure of everything that had been accumulating behind it. They talked about the city, what it looked like from below, and what it looked like from here. They talked about power and what it cost and what it bought. They talked about grief, briefly, with the precision of people who had survived theirs and did not handle it carelessly. At one point, Nadia said something that made Reina laugh, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, nothing like the controlled, minimal expression of amusement she deployed in professional contexts. The laugh happened, and then it was over, and Reina looked at Nadia with something naked in her face for just a moment, something uncontrolled and not meant to be seen, and seen anyway. And then she recovered it, and Nadia let her, because she understood the need. She went home that night and sat in her small, orderly kitchen and thought about a laugh. Thought about a woman who had built a fortress to protect what was left of her after loss, who had spent 20 years making that fortress perfect and impenetrable, and what it would take to walk through it, and whether that was something Nadia was equipped to do, and whether she had already, without intending to, begun. The complication came 8 weeks in. Complications always came. The variable was never whether, it was when, and how bad, and whether you were prepared. The complication was a man named Devereaux. He ran a competing organisation out of the Northern District and had for 3 years maintained a careful, mutually agreed upon distance from Reina's operations. He had apparently decided that the agreement no longer served him. He had moved on 2 of her revenue points in the same week, not enough to be open provocation, but enough to be a message. The way you tap your fingers on a table to make someone look at you. And through channels designed to be unofficially deniable, he had made it known that his interest in renegotiating certain territorial understandings was connected specifically to his interest in Reina's newest acquisition, meaning Nadia. He had seen her at a venue. He had made inquiries. He understood what she was, or thought he did. A fighter with unusual gifts, brought into Reina's operation as a physical asset, a commodity, something that could be leveraged. What he did not understand, what his intelligence picture was catastrophically wrong about, was that the fighter with unusual gifts had also, in 8 weeks, become something that was not simply operational to Reina Vasquez. And approaching her as a commodity was the single most dangerous calculation Devereaux could have made, because Reina Vasquez, who had never in 20 years made a personal decision, who had built her entire empire on the discipline of not wanting anything she could not afford to lose, Reina Vasquez had just discovered, on an otherwise quiet Wednesday evening, in an office with 2 glasses and a city outside the window, that the rule she had lived by the longest was the one she was about to break. Reina found out on a Monday morning. She received the intelligence. She processed it with characteristic stillness. She met with Sola and Paco and Berta and made several decisions. And then she called Nadia into her office and told her, with complete and direct honesty, which was not a thing she owed her, and which she gave her anyway. She said, "There is a man who believes he can use you as leverage against me." She said, "I want you to understand the situation clearly, because you have a right to understand it, and because what happens next requires your involvement. And I will not involve you in something this personal without your full understanding of what it is." Nadia sat with this. She said, "What does he think you'll do?" Reina said, "He thinks I'll accommodate him to protect an asset. He thinks that is the nature of our arrangement." Nadia said, "And what is the nature of our arrangement?" The room was very quiet. Outside, the city continued its 24-hour performance of itself. Traffic, sirens, the perpetual machinery of a place that never entirely stopped. Reina looked at Nadia across the desk, and for a moment the composure she had rebuilt over 8 weeks flickered. And what was underneath it was not a chess player, not a queen, not the architecture of power and consequence she had built over 20 years. It was simply a person who had learned to want very little and had not expected to want this, and who was looking at it now with exhausted, complicated honesty that was more intimate than anything they had yet exchanged. She said, "I believe you already know." What happened next moved quickly. Reina sent Devereaux a response through the appropriate channels, measured, precise, containing within its precision an implicit inventory of everything she knew about his operation, his vulnerabilities, his people, his interests. Together, these constituted an unmistakable statement of costs. Simultaneously, she moved on the 2 revenue points he had touched, not aggressively, but decisively, reclaiming them in a way that required minimal confrontation and maximum demonstration of preparation. The message, received through multiple vectors at once, was the organisational equivalent of someone picking up a glass they have been playing with and setting it very deliberately back in its place. Devereaux recalibrated. He was not a stupid man. He sent back a response that was, in the formal language of these things, a withdrawal dressed in the courtesy of strategic conversation he intended to resume at a more propitious time. Reina received it, noted it, and moved on, with the confidence of someone who had read the situation correctly from the beginning and was not surprised by the outcome. The empire held. The message had been sent. The Queen had protected her board. But that was not the part of that week that mattered most. The evening after the situation resolved, Reina asked Nadia to meet her not at the office, but at the penthouse. This was a first. In 8 weeks of considerable proximity, the penthouse had been Reina's alone, the one space not operational, not shared, not a stage for the performance of power. Inviting Nadia into it was not a casual gesture. Both of them understood it was not a casual gesture. Nadia came at 8 in the evening. The penthouse was extraordinary in the way that things built with complete financial freedom and the specific taste of someone who spent 20 years looking at the city from below before they lived above it could be extraordinary. It was not ostentatious, it was precise. Every element chosen with the same economy she brought to everything. Nothing present that did not serve a function or express something true. There were books, many of them. There was music playing low, something instrumental and thoughtful. There were the floor-to-ceiling windows, and through them the city like a promise or a threat, depending on the night. Tonight it looked like neither. Tonight it looked like something that simply was, vast and lit and real. Reina made dinner. This was perhaps the most surprising thing that had happened in the entire 8 weeks. Not the fact of the dinner, but the fact of her making it. Standing at the counter in her penthouse in the clothes she wore when no one was watching, which turned out to be simpler and darker and more comfortable than the severe professional armature of the workplace, moving through the kitchen with a focused competence that was entirely characteristic and entirely disarming, in the way that watching someone excellent do something ordinary is always disarming, because it reminds you that they are a person, and persons are vulnerable in ways that power cannot entirely insulate. They ate. They talked. The conversation moved through things that were not operational. Reina told her things she did not usually tell people. About the city when she had first come to own a piece of it, and how that felt, not triumphant as people assumed, but terrifying in a way she had not permitted herself to acknowledge until years later. About the specific geometry of solitude that came with the kind of power she had built. The way it separated you from others, not because you chose it, but because the power itself created a distance that most people found unbridgeable and stopped trying. About the fact that she had stopped expecting anything to bridge it and had made peace with that, and how the peace was real and still insufficient. Nadia listened. She offered what she had, the truth of who she was, in the sparse, economic language she used for everything. She said, "I have spent my entire adult life being very careful not to need anything I couldn't afford to lose." She paused. "I'm not sure I was capable of wanting this 6 months ago." She paused again. "I don't know what I'm capable of now." Reina was standing at the window. She turned. The city was behind her, lit and enormous. She said, "I spent 20 years building something indestructible." She stopped, and in the silence that followed, both of them heard everything that was not said. That indestructible things were not the same as complete things, and that she was standing here, understanding, for the first time in a very long time, that it did not protect you from everything. Nadia crossed the room, not quickly, not dramatically, the way she moved through a fight, without waste, without performance, with the complete directness of someone who had stopped thinking about the approach and had simply committed. She stopped in front of Reina, close enough that the distance between them was no longer the kind you could maintain a pretense inside of. She looked at her. Reina looked back. For a long moment, neither of them moved, because the moment before a thing is also the last moment before the thing, and both of them were, in their different ways, honouring that. Then Reina Vasquez, who had built a world on the premise of not wanting what she could not control, reached up and placed her hand along Nadia's jaw, carefully, as though she were handling something she understood the precise value of. And Nadia covered her hand with her own, and the city went on being the city behind them, vast and indifferent and luminous, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in every room they had been in together for the past 8 weeks. Here is what this story is actually about. It is not about a mafia queen and a street fighter. It is not about an empire or a basement or a man who miscalculated what he could use as leverage. It is about the specific kind of courage that has no audience and no applause. The courage of 2 women who had each, through completely different paths and completely different losses, arrived at the same place. A life that was safe, functional, and sealed shut. And who found in each other, against every rule and every precedent and every carefully constructed wall, a reason to unseal it. Nadia Cruz had spent 4 years being the most dangerous thing in any room she entered. The danger was always in her body, her hands, her speed, the trained and perfect readiness of her. But standing in a penthouse, 42 floors above the city, with her hand covering the hand of a woman who had just, for the first time in 20 years, chosen to want something she could not control, Nadia understood that the most dangerous thing she had ever done had nothing to do with fighting. It had everything to do with staying. What happened next is not the story that ends the way these stories are supposed to end. It did not end in fire. It did not end in tragedy, which is what people who distrust happiness expect when 2 women like these choose it, as though the universe is obligated to punish the audacity of it, as though joy between people who have suffered is somehow illegitimate, somehow borrowed against a debt that will eventually come due. It did not come due, not in the way those people expect. The world in which they lived was never going to become simple, because it was never simple to begin with. Reina's empire remained exactly what it was. Nadia continued to become more than she had been, which is what happens when someone with her gifts is finally given room. The complications kept coming because complications always came, but they came now into a space that was not empty, into a world that had been built by one extraordinary woman to keep everything out, and that now, by choice, contained something it had never contained before. Not just a person, not just a partner, but the specific, irreducible experience of being known, being read, as accurately and as fully as Nadia read a fight, as precisely and as completely as Reina read a room, and not being feared because of it or managed because of it, simply being known and stayed. Sola told Berta eventually, in the careful way Sola told anyone anything, "I have not seen her want to protect something before." As though the empire itself did not count, which perhaps was Sola's point. The empire was something Reina had built to protect herself. This was different. This was Reina, who had spent 20 years being untouchable, discovering that she had never actually wanted to be untouchable. She had wanted to be safe enough to choose. Nadia Cruz, who had stood in the eastern quarter of this city with nothing but her body and her intelligence and the combustible compound of grief and talent that made her, found herself standing at the center of the most powerful woman in the city's world and discovering something she had not expected to discover. That the version of herself she had decided was the final version was not. That the woman who had needed nothing and asked for nothing and kept herself small and controlled and completely self-sufficient was not the end of the story. She was the beginning of it. She had simply been waiting in the only way she knew how to wait, by being excellent, by being still, by standing in the centre of cleared spaces and reading everything around her, for the right place to land. There is a city that exists in two worlds simultaneously. In one world, a woman in silk looks at it from above and calculates. In the other world, a woman in a cleared space takes the measure of what is in front of her and decides. This story began in a basement, in the moment a gaze moved across a room and landed and held. In the moment two people who had built their entire lives around not being stopped were stopped. Not by a weapon, not by a threat, not by anything that had ever stopped them before, by something as quiet and as unreasonable and as completely irrefutable as recognition. The simple, devastating experience of looking at another person and understanding, without wanting to, without planning to, without any of the permission structures or safety protocols that had governed every other decision of your adult life, that this was someone who was going to matter. Reina Vasquez, who had spent 20 years taking the city apart and rebuilding it according to her will. Nadia Cruz, who had spent 4 years being the most dangerous thing in any room. Both of them, without consultation, without coordination, without a single one of the careful, strategic calculations they brought to everything else, both of them had made the same decision in the same basement on the same Thursday night. The moment two sets of eyes met across a room full of blood and money and noise and decided against all operational logic, her. The city kept going, it always did, and somewhere on the 42nd floor, in a penthouse that had been built to keep the world out, the lights stayed on long past midnight, and the two most dangerous women in the city were, for the first time in longer than either of them could honestly remember, exactly where they wanted to be. Not calculating, not surviving, not building walls, or managing distances, or rehearsing the performance of needing nothing. Simply there, together, in a room where both of them, finally, had chosen to stay.